Is France becoming more anti-Jewish, or has hate speech simply become more inhibited? One of the triggers for rallies taking place this Tuesday against anti-Semitism was a diatribe at a Yellow Vest demonstration last weekend against Jewish intellectual Anna-Finkielkraut. We can hear shouts of "the people will punish you," "Zionist," "France is ours." Yellow Vest protesters blame fringe elements. But among those that feel threatened by globalization, old conspiracy theories about the stateless Jew who manipulates the world order have made a surprising and alarming comeback. Not just on the far right, and not just in France, where anti-Semitic incidents jumped 74% last year. Inside the UK's Labour Party, where 7 MPs have just quit, it's the far left leadership that stands accused of turning solidarity with the Palestinian cause into a full-on culture of anti-Semitism. There are also more attacks, by the way, against mosques and churches. Is it social media that's enabling hate speech and a fostering of a culture of violence? More broadly, is that violence born from, well, a changing world order that's weakened institutions like trade unions and local government, institutions that used to channel grievances and perhaps tone down extremes? Today, where can we find that public space where all sides can feel heard and where the common good can prevail? Today in the France 24 debate, we're talking about the resurgence of anti-Semitism. With us, attorney Ruben Sfaj. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
I want to welcome back as well Juan Branco, also attorney, representing one of those Yellow Vest protesters. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
From London, Ben Gidley, who lectures in psychosocial studies at Birkbeck College, University of London, the co-author of Anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in Europe, A Shared Story. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good evening.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and on Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yeah, ahead of the rallies taking place this Tuesday in France, the president making the trip to the Alsatian village of Katzenheim. That's near the German border, where at least 80 graves at a Jewish cemetery were daubed with swastikas overnight. One of them bears the words Black Alsatian Wolves, a 1970s separatist group with links to neo-Nazis. Ruben Sfaj, your thoughts on this?
My main thought is that, you mentioned that this resurgence was kind of surprising, but if we take a good look at it, we are seeing the high point of a process that started probably 15 years back or even longer than that.
15.
I would say, because people forget, people have short memory, but in 2002, the National Front was in the second round of the French presidential election for the first time. And ever since, we've seen a slow but steady rise, not just in anti-Semitism in the ideological form, but also in actions and in attacks and in deaths. And we're probably reaching the point where speeches just aren't enough anymore, and finding, maybe not excuses, but finding buts and ifs and while and ifs and then won't just cut it anymore. We need probably to take a good hard look at what kind of society we're becoming and at what we're really doing beyond mere words about anti-Semitism.
When there's a cemetery that's desecrated like this, is it just fringe elements? What do you make of it?
The problem is that every time an anti-Semitic attack occurs, you hear that same idea that it's fringe elements of whatever group is being mentioned. It's fringe elements of the extreme right, and then it's fringe elements of the gilets jaunes, the yellow vests, and then it's always fringe elements of something. But if you take all those fringe elements together, it starts being a lot of people. And that brings us to what shocked a lot of people here were these images of Anna-Finkielkraut. He's this famous French Jewish intellectual returning to his Paris Left Bank apartment last Saturday during the Yellow Vests protests.
C'est la France de
Juan Branco, what was your reaction to that?
I'm very disturbed by these images because, of course, anti-Semitism is for me a huge problem. And when I see the images of the terms that are painted with a Svaritza, I have like a physical reaction to it, a very violent one, because my PhD is on mass violence and how it occurs and trying to understand that. But in these images, the disturbing part is that this same person that rejects Alain Finkiel's quote from the manifestation treats him of being racist, and it seems to be accusing him of having been a hatred mongerer, because he has been a very close person to some ideologists of a very far right thought. So it's very difficult always to interpret images, and I don't want to excuse any act that would be anti-Semitic. I don't want to take that risk, but I want to make clear that these images are not that as clear as they had said. That said, the data regarding anti-Semitism is very clear and has been rising. We have more than 600 acts of anti-Semitism last year, and we have an important issue on that. But I wouldn't agree on the fact that it comes from 2002, and I think it's a real debate we should have, because we've seen the extreme right, le Rassemblement National today, trying to create an opportunistic movement that is very disturbing, in which they signed a communique pretending that they condemned themselves these kind of acts, and that they were so the same party that has been fueling this anti-Semitism for 50 years now tries to play the Republican part, and we don't know for what kind of hypocrisy now is being created by this party. And I don't know if it's just a tactical mention of Marine Le Pen in order to manipulate the opinion in this moment, or if there is a real change in it. I don't think there is a real change. I think extreme right is defined by one of the main factors is anti-Semitism. The other is racism in general.
Is there a problem in the yellow vest, though? Because one of the words he says there is, we are the people.
Yes.
We
yes.
are
So
the people will punish you.
So people have deduced it from being,
le peuple. The people will punish you, and that is the people is something that we hear a lot in the yellow vest protest.
But,
what does it mean in this?
I don't know what I don't know if he was an anti-Semitic person. Maybe I don't know. I'm
not sure.
I don't know if this was because he accuses him of being racist. I'm really saying this in a very innocent way. I'm not saying that there is not anti-Semitism in the movement, and there's been a real question and a real fight in the movement to try to expurge the movement from all the extreme right personalities. There's even been physical fights between anti-fascists and extreme right in order to put aside the people from the yellow vest that were participating in these ideologies. I don't know if this event is an anti-Semitic event. I don't know, and I hope that there will be an investigation that will clarify it.
Is it an anti-Semitic event, what we just saw in those images?
If it is not an anti-Semitic event, what the hell is it? I mean, guy goes home, crosses a group of angry people, gets slurred and verbally attacked for being a Jew.
No,
if that's not anti-Semitic, if that's not anti-Semitic,
there is no mention of the Jewishness.
If that's not anti-Semitic, what the hell is? If you follow that line of thought, which I understand, wanting always more proof and always more certainty, if you follow that line of thought, then truly nothing short of anti-Semitic murder is anti-Semitism. Calling somebody a dirty Zionist when their positions, for however far right they might be or interpreted as being, are not, fully supportive even of the Israeli right. Telling somebody that they are not at home in France, that's not just anti-Semitic. That is racist, and that is full-blown hatred. And I would like to add also that involuntary or voluntary blindness on this issue goes way and well beyond anti-Semitism. You have people who have been verbally attacked at the roundabouts where the yellow vests have their meetings and hold their blockades for being black or for being Muslims or for being homosexuals or whatever you like. What we're talking about here, and anti-Semitism is a very interesting witness, and it's a very interesting measure of the rising level of hatred in France. And if you address that issue by asking yourself, but are they truly on the far right, or are they truly on the far left? And if you start asking yourself all other questions, save for the only important one, which is how do we address that huge, tremendous, violent hatred, I think you're on the wrong path.
I want to bring in Ben Gidley on this. But Ben, the Yellow Vest protest started as originally a movement to say enough with the unfair burden of taxes being felt by the lower middle classes that felt squeezed. It morphed into something bigger. It's a leaderless movement. Can we draw conclusions from that exchange that we saw?
I'm not sure that we can draw conclusions from that exchange because it's a leaderless movement, because it's horizontal, because it's contradictory. It's very hard to kind of define the movement in terms of any particular moment. But I think one of the interesting things is the way this contradictory, divergent kind of movement, what is it that binds it? And I think sometimes one of the things that can bind it is conspiracy theory or anti-elitism. And those are political positions, narratives that can shade into anti-Semitism.
Why is that? Because we've seen opinion polls that show that a sizable percentage believe not just in a Jewish conspiracy, but also that the Illuminati are somehow real. I don't know how accurate these polls are, but why is it that there's all this conspiracy theory talk?
Well, I think we're living in a time when there's been a crisis of trust in sources of authority, sources of information, sources of knowledge. And so people seek alternative truths. So people no longer believe the kind of truths that they're taught by official institutions. And so they're going elsewhere, in particular to social media, to the internet, to YouTube, to alternative media platforms. And I think once you stop believing in truth, almost anything can be true. And so these kind of Illuminati type stories that seem to explain a complex globalized world, they offer kind of simple explanations. Hidden power, secret power offers a simple explanation for the very complex globalized world that we're living in that people squeeze.
Juan Branco, there is an element about the Yellow Vest, which is about identity, this feeling that people in France feel like they're becoming disenfranchised.
I don't agree at all. I mean, the identity debates that were parasiting the French media and the French political debate for months have been completely, have gone away for these months since the Gilets jaunes. We were obsessed with migration, we were obsessed with Islam, we were obsessed with these questions that disappeared in the moment in which the real question, which is a social question, raised again. I really want to say something because we're talking about truth in media. Alain Finkielkraut himself said that he wasn't treated as a Jew in this event, that he wasn't treated as a sale juif, as it was said. So I really think we have to be very rigorous on the facts on these issues.
But they did say to him, go
Yes.
back to Tel Aviv. He's not from Tel Aviv. He's French.
I haven't heard that. Maybe if you tell me so, okay. I didn't know about that until now. What I saw of the video was not that. But if you tell me so, I agree. I'm not trying to defend someone that is not defendable. In the general way, in the Gilets jaunes, there is a question which is all these movements, which are from Soral, from the extreme right, very completist, have been trying to stick around and enter into the movement in trying to get again a voice in this public sphere after we have managed to put them aside. And so they've tried to use this opening in the public debate to enter in it. There's been huge struggles in trying to put them aside again. It's very complicated because indeed there are people who trust them because they, as the interlocutor was saying, they're trying to find simple explanation for complex solutions, for complex problems, and this movement is on the other hand, really trying to struggle to try to sanitize itself. And I've been in Commercy, for example, which was an important event because you had like 75 roundabouts that were like reunited.
Commercy in the east of France.
In the east of France, 75 roundabouts from all over France that came to the movement, and they tried, and each of them presented themselves. And it was at some point during the presentations, one of them said, I feel really better when I hear you because we knew what we were doing. We knew that we were anti-racist. We knew we were anti-homophobia. We knew we were anti-sexist. But we had ended up thinking that this movement was about other things. And and seeing that you agree with us, that you are indeed very engaged into these struggles against these phenomenon is a relief. In general, the problem.
But it is a leaderless movement. And so, as a leaderless movement, there are some from the far left,
yes,
some from the far right.
People that are trying to manipulate it and put it aside from the original movement, from the original nature of the movement. Sorry.
What you're saying is not, honestly, it's not something that's easy to disagree with. The problem with it is that I think the Yellow Vest movement started out, yes, as a fiscal protest. And as such, it wasn't the first in French history. And, it gained a lot of traction as first a fiscal protest. And then probably something a bit larger, a bit wider about, issues about how do you make a living in France. And basically, I think it went beyond that. And that's where it gained the most traction, where with or without mentioning it clearly, it was about what exactly is the place of the common man, of the common Frenchman in tomorrow's world. And that's when the movement, I think, gained the most traction and had the most empathy from French people and even, beyond France. Fortunately, as most social movements, starting gaining traction, gaining weight just because, and that's the way it is. You can't be on top of the news forever, even when you have a lot of traction. And that's when I think something went wrong. And that's when I think you get yourself into this position where, that's interesting because people who are, left-leaning will tell you that the far right is trying to integrate the movement and to manipulate it. Well, the funny thing is, people on the far right are telling you exactly the opposite. That people on the far left are trying to manipulate the movement and trying to make it say things it doesn't want to say.
But the fact is that...
And so, in my opinion, we're seeing something that basically has gotten out of control and has just become, and you have to see beyond the yellow vest here, it's become yet another avatar, yet another episode of something that was a looming hatred in France and a looming appetite for destruction, I truly believe, that has found yet another way to express itself. And, I was here a few days ago to discuss the Ligue du Lol, and we were discussing how the mob mentality turned, nice little Parisian guys, journalists and communication people, into people who would harass women, Jews, Muslims, homosexuals, and something truly horrible. And I think at some level, the Yellow Vests have maybe, without their founders, the original founders' will, but still, have finally allowed for something similar, much more dangerous, and a much larger scale to occur.
All right, we're going to pick up on that point when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're speaking as statistics have come out recently about an upsurge of anti-Semitic acts in this country. Also, we were talking about in part one of our discussion, this diatribe that happened on the sidelines of a Yellow Vests protest targeting a prominent French Jewish intellectual last Saturday. Rallies taking place this Tuesday in several French cities, including Paris. With us to talk about it, attorney Ruben Svaj. Also with us, attorney Juan Branco. Welcome back as well to Ben Gidley, who lectures in psychosocial studies at Birkbeck College, University of London. That intellectual, Alain Finkielkraut, insists the anti-Semitism of today is not the anti-Semitism of the 1930s. He says it comes more for him, he's a conservative intellectual, from the hard left and from those who equate solidarity with Israel with Judaism. For his part, the French president coming out against the idea of a law criminalizing anti-Zionism.
I don't think that penalizing anti-Zionism is a good solution. I do believe that those who say they want Israel to disappear want to target Jews. But when you examine the issue of outlawing anti-Zionism, you realize this would cause a number of problems.
Ruben Svaj, you agree with the president?
I do. For three reasons. First is the laws against racism and anti-Semitism in speech, unfortunately in France, haven't produced tremendous results. That's number one. Number two, I think, as President Macron said, I think we would have more issues and unintended consequences from further criminalizing speech, especially anti-Zionist speech. Anti-Zionism is very, very often a very shallow disguise for anti-Semitism. But at the same time, you can't just shut somebody down because they're criticizing Israel or even because they don't like Israel. People have all their right not to like Israel, so long as they respect its right to exist. And thirdly, because there are already laws against boycotting foreign countries in France, and they're very effective. And I just don't believe in laws of circumstance, as we sometimes call them in France. I don't think it's the best way to address any issue. We've been doing that for a long time with anti-Semitism and racism, and here we are. We're not any better off of it.
All right, this brings us to what's happening in the UK. We have had 7 members of parliament quitting the Labour Party on Monday, among them Liverpool MP Luciana Berger, who herself is Jewish. She says the leadership of her party is, quote, willfully and repeatedly failed to address hatred against Jewish people within its ranks. It's a phrase that's been picked up on by the moderate deputy leader of the Labour Party, Tom Watson.
They say anti-Semitism is a light sleeper. This is certainly a wake-up call for the Labour Party. We were slow to acknowledge we had a problem and even slower to deal with it. Even a single incident of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party shames us. It shames us all. Now we've lost Luciana, one of our most dedicated and courageous MPs. If someone like her no longer believes there's a role for her in the Labour Party, then many other colleagues I know will be asking themselves how they can stay. That's why time is short for us to confront the scale of the problem and meet the consequences, to keep others from leaving.
Ben Gidley, what's happening inside the Labour Party?
Well, it's a very complicated situation, and a lot of the commentary on it tries to simplify it a little too much. I think there is no doubt that there's a widespread problem of anti-Semitism bubbling around the fringes of the Labour Party. It's absolutely not the majority of the membership or the majority of the support, and it's definitely not kind of a unique case in British society. The anti-Semitism of the Labour Party is anti-Semitism which circulates in British society at large. But I think it's also the case there are some forms of anti-Semitism which have taken particular root within the left of the Labour Party. Conspiracy theories and some of the kind of anti-Semitic forms of anti-Zionism are more at home on the left than on the right. And I think that the leadership of the party, it's made many efforts to address the problem, but it's also made a number of kind of missteps, miscommunications that have left Jewish members of the party feeling very uncomfortable within the party. And there is definitely bullying and harassment of some Jewish members.
Juan Branco, your reaction to the row that's broken out publicly inside the UK Labour Party?
I'm really sorry not to have a knowledge of the situation to comment on it. I mean, on the principle, of course, it is shocking to see that. But I want just to come back on I'm very saddened and in a sense confused that we confuse this rise of anti-Semitism in France in general with the Yellow Vest movement, which has started only like mid-November, and the data regarding rise of anti-Semitism is on 2018 as a whole, so it cannot be attributed to the Yellow Vest. Maybe the presence of anti-Semitic acts in the Yellow Vest is a symptom of a wider problem inside the society, and I think it is that. I don't know if there is a specific problem in the Yellow Vest. I'm not sure about it, and I'm just have an anecdote that has the value it has. But this same Saturday that this happened with Alain Finkielkraut, we at some point we demonstrated with Maxime Nicole, one of the spokespersons of the Yellow Vest, who has very clearly, as all the main spokespersons of the Yellow Vest stated, that they were against racism, anti-Semitism, homophobia, and sexism. We at some point a person who had a kippah and came to us in order to film itself to show that Jewish were safe inside the Yellow Vest movement and could demonstrate with others. So
is it fantastic?
I'm not saying there is a value. I'm not saying there is. It gives more. Yeah, it's as anecdotic as the other. In that sense, we're discussing about. We cannot treat a movement starting on, and this is a mediatic problem.
But your anecdotes about a spokesperson. Is it time then, in that case, to structure? Perhaps more.
So that is the difficulty.
Because people making racist or anti-Semitic remarks at the local cafe, that's always existed.
And there are two reactions to that. The first one is to be very clear on the fact that there is no solidarity with this kind of actions or words, and this has been done. And the second one is to censor any kind of expression of these words and actions in the groups that they manage, because as you know, the movement.
But what I'm asking you is it time to structure more?
But I'm just answering you that the way the movement is handled is through Facebook groups in which people are post things, and the role of the spokespersons is to manage those groups and manage what it gets posted on that. And there is a very, very strong caution on the fact of not letting pass any kind of anti-Semitic content, any kind of racist content, any kind of conspirationist content. And this effort has been done since day one, not since Saturday, because there's been a higher social pressure in order to be careful about these issues. Since the beginning, these people have been very clear on the fact that all the identitarian questions were masks in order not to speak about the question that was important, which was the social question, and that minorities should not be targeted in any ways as an excuse. All
right, let's talk about social media, because you kind of had the impression after the Finkielkraut incident this weekend that there was a battle of hashtags, because there was anti-Semitism, but there was also anti-Zionism. And the two were in competition.
You speak on Twitter.
On Twitter.
The movement is almost unpresent on Twitter. If you see about the leader, the spokespersons, they have very few followers on Twitter. What happens basically on Facebook. Maybe there is a reaction from the extreme right and the extreme left. I am not being partisan on the issue on Twitter, but from the movement itself, the roots of the movement, it has not been the case.
Listening to Ben Gidley and hearing what Rumen Sfaj said, do you agree with him that there is an element where at some point anti-Zionism, expressing criticism of Israel, veers into anti-Semitism?
I think there is a very clear question about this, and more generally about how anti-Semitism has been masked. And that's why I was speaking about the extreme right and Marine Le Pen, about how it is transforming in new ways that are more hidden, because they are trying to impose themselves without showing too explicitly that they're anti-Semitic. So I'm completely agreeing with the
Ben Gidley saying it's also from the far left. It's not just the far right.
It's far right, far left people who are not politicized in any way. It is a societal problem, and I want to be very radical on this. I think one of the main sources of anti-Semitism in France is the Christian culture that still has this bouc émissaire way of scapegoat treating of these questions.
I'd like to. And it's kind of a pity that they wouldn't spend more time on the UK Labour issue, because, it's a good... That's probably a parallel to be drawn. And I don't doubt your sincerity at all. At the same time, I think part of what caused, and Ben will probably correct me if I'm wrong, but I think part of what caused the situation with the UK Labour Party is a voluntary or involuntary, which is worse, double speech, where you condemn anti-Semitism, you denounce, and you swear by all your gods that, calm the ugly beast, you will be first. You would be first online to fight it. And then, each time something happens, you find good reason to say, yeah, but that's not the case right now. Oh, Finkielkraut, dirty Zionist, that's not dirty Jew. And then something else, and it's never, your promise is you, in fact, never kept. Your promise is, in fact, never applied. And I think part of what causes a lot of disarray, not just for Jews and not just for minorities, but for everybody in France who believes that we're in a democracy, and as Albert Camus said, a democracy is not the law of the majority, it's the protection offered to any minority. And I think what causes a lot of disarray to people who are attached to the idea of democracy and the idea of diversity is not just the rising of anti-Semitism, of racism. It's this constant paradox between more and more promises of being alert and vigilant on the issue, and of every time you need to act on this promise, finding some good reason not to.
Ben Gidley, let me ask you, because here in this country, we have seen labor parties get weaker. We've seen political institutions get weaker. I know over in the UK right now, we've just talked about the Labour Party being divided. The Conservative Party is divided. The media is always being bashed as not credible, as you were saying. Do we live in an era where there's kind of a new kind of political vacuum and where it's easier for hate speech to come in?
Yes, I think that is the case. We're living in a time of new politics where leaderless movements, contradictory political formations flourish, and some of the old certainties are not the case. I think looking at the Labour Party specifically, I think that point is partially correct that I wouldn't say there's a double think in the sense of an insincerity about the opposition to anti-Semitism. I think the problem is with anti-Semitism an inability to recognize the new forms that anti-Semitism takes. It's easy to recognize anti-Semitism when it comes in the form of the far right, when it's wearing a Nazi uniform. It's harder to recognize it when it takes these newer, more ambiguous forms, when it takes an anti-Zionist form, for example. Or when it takes a conspiratorial form. And so it's very hard for the left, I think for the political culture of the left, for example, to see victims of racism who might be relatively privileged in society, like Alan Finkielkraut, who is not one of the most marginalized people in society, but nonetheless is the victim of racism. That's a difficult contradiction for the culture of the left to understand.
Why is there this new form? Why is there this new form?
Well, I think that the old, there are old Christian forms of anti-Semitism. They are still around, but they're losing their power in a more secular world. There are the old pseudoscientific biological forms of anti-Semitism. They're still around on the far right, but on the whole, they were thoroughly discredited by the Holocaust. Anti-Semitism and racism, they mutate. They take new forms over time. And so we live in a time when people don't like to think of themselves as racist, when people don't like to think of themselves as prejudiced, when people are anti-racist in terms of their identity, and yet nonetheless kind of pick up narratives that are racist or anti-Semitic in effect, that narratives that draw from an old repertoire of racism and anti-Semitism. So it's how do those old forms of anti-Semitism become articulated in an age when people don't like to think of themselves as prejudiced, when we disavow racism, we don't like to see ourselves as racist. So it's a kind of a post, we'd like to think of this as a post-racist world. And so racism in that context takes on new forms.
Do you agree with that, Juan Branco?
No, I think there are people who are very proud of being racist today in this country, especially regarding anti-Semitism. We were talking about Alain Soral. He really admits very clearly to be an anti-Semitic.
But there are people who, in the name of solidarity with the Palestinians, and there's every reason to be in solidarity with the way Palestinians are treated in some instances, that in the name of that do generalize, use prejudice, use that as a cover to be anti-Semitic. I completely agree, but I still think that there is still a huge problem of racism and anti-Semitism in this country, which is admitted as such, and we've seen it in the degradation of the terms, in which they created as Faritska. So, and this is a huge problem. We shouldn't think that there is everyone pretends to be not racist. No, I think there is a huge problem today still of people who are neo-Nazis.
I have one question.
Yes.
On the one hand, you agree that anti-Semitism takes new forms and is able to hide between the guise of anti-Zionism. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, a guy calls a Jew a dirty Zionist and tells him to go back to Tel Aviv because France doesn't belong to him. But to you, that's not anti-Semitism.
No, it's maybe anti-Semitic. As I tell you, I didn't know about the. As I told you, I didn't know about the Tel Aviv mention of it. So
without the Tel Aviv mention, you think
no,
that would still be down?
Without the Tel Aviv mention, I saw someone treating Alain Finkielkraut of being racist because he's very close to very racist ideologies. He has invited someone who's called Renaud Camus, who has the theorization of the Great Replacement, which theorizes the fact that immigrants in his show in France Culture, which theorizes the fact that immigrants are here to replace French people of souche. I don't know how to translate that, but I mean, he's been speaking with his vocabulary, indigenous French.
But do you think then do you
So
think then
I
that
just
somebody,
said that yes.
and to make it clear, I don't side with Alain Finkielkraut on most of his positions. Okay,
Which can be racist. We agree on that, no? I mean,
Absolutely.
but I'm not justifying at all the fact that there is violence against this person.
Would you say
Yes.
that somebody who makes comments that are on the verge of racism deserves to be treated like this?
No, and that's what I want to say. Whatever we consider, whether it is anti-Semitism, which it seems to be if there was this Tel Aviv mention, or other, the scene was violent in any way, and there is clearly a problem of violence in this country, and the problem of violence is always the expression of weakness of politics and of the communication between.
There's a re-legitimization of violence?
A what? Sorry?
A re-legitimization of violence?
Yes,
the rhetoric is violent. It's violent
in general, and even insurrectional.
It's violent even from Donald Trump. It's violent from the leaders of
and
lots
even
of
from the
political
country
parties.
against the government, because there is a very strong incapacity of the leaders, and that's why I heard, I don't know if it was you or the person who was intervening through Skype saying that anti-elitism can bring to anti-Semitism. I think it's a very, very dangerous statement. First, because it associates a community with the Jewish community with elites, which is it's an anti-Semitic statement. But more generally, anti-elitism today can be justified.
Do you know how a lobster is cooked?
Well,
a lobster is cooked. It's called slow boiling. You know how that works? Put it in water, turn the notch up 1 degree every minute. In about 40, 50 minutes, an hour, your lobster is done, you can eat it. Never knew what happened to him. And if you think in this case, the lobster is the Jews, you got it all wrong. It's France and it's Europe.
one final point on this. In May of 1990, at a time when the far-right National Front was still new as a political force, some 200,000 people rallied in Paris after the desecration of a Jewish cemetery in the southern town of Carpentras. Marchers included a surprise cameo by the then president, François Mitterrand. Today, you won't get 200,000 people in the streets of France, or at least you haven't so far. Why is that?
I think, and again, it's my point of view, that this is also part of what I was mentioning just right now.
There was a novelty then?
I think there was a novelty then, and I think it's two things at the same time. I would say first, it's, a slow but certain re-legitimization, yes, of hatred and of anti-Semitism in the form of, we get used to everything, and if something happens once, it's a very, very serious situation. It keeps happening. You won't go into the streets of Paris every week. That's number one. Number two, I think there is this sense of impending doom. And there is this sense that, what can we do about it? Not much. And so going out into the streets of Paris for the 10th time, I've heard people say that to me, Jews and non-Jews alike, about tonight's gathering. They said, but why would we do that? There's no point. It's useless. What's going to happen? And in my opinion, this is part of something much larger. And we are basically, Europe and probably the Western world and Western civilization is at risk of getting a little too much used to devaluing democracy, devaluing diversity, and devaluing the basic respect we owe to others in their difference and similarities to us. And I truly believe that what is happening is every time we are afraid of naming the obvious, every time we think that for some reason we should add something at the end of our sentence. Every time we think that for some reason we should, not do something about it immediately because there are other interests at hand. Every time we do one of those things, it's not just we're not doing anything, we're contributing to this evil. And all of us are concerned.
Ben Gidley, is democracy on the slippery slope the way it's described there by Ruben Svaj?
I think to some extent, and I think it's definitely the case that Jews are often one of the canaries in the gold mine. I mean, it's not just Jews, but other minorities as well. You can take racist attacks as a kind of a good indicator of the health of a democracy in society.
Yeah, you do well to mention it because we've had a spate of attacks against churches. There are also regularly attacks, Islamophobic attacks in France.
For sure. I mean, migrants, minorities, Roma, Gypsies, Muslims have been very much on the hard edge of attacks in France, in the UK, in the United States, across Europe. And I think, Jews and other minorities are the first victims of sickness in democracy.
Juan Branco?
Yeah, I think we should insist also on the responsibility of the elites. When Emmanuel Macron thought it would be normal to give tribute to the Maréchal Pétain, just ignoring completely the enormous impact and influence he had on the decisions that led to the death of many Jews. When you have a few years before the Prime Minister Manuel Valls, who had racist comments on the Gypsy community and the Romanian community just in order to gain popular weight, when you have this kind of behavior that nourish the legitimation of any kind of racism, anti-Semitism, of course it triggers then a social reaction which considers itself legitimated in order to act on this. So we have to, again, to be very careful on the fact of associating anti-elitist discourse to any kind of fight against this.
But where Emmanuel Macron and the leader of the far left seem to be in agreement is they both like this sort of concept of more direct democracy, more the president or the leader should speak to the people directly not through the institutions.
But I'm very disturbed.
And the weakening of those institutions,
I'm very disturbed
be it Jean-Luc Mélenchon or Emmanuel Macron, are they also creating that vacuum that allows hate speech?
I'm very disturbed by this whole discussion in which there's been a huge confusion between the yellow vest, these issues which are much wider, the question of direct democracy. I mean, we cannot have a serious debate in which we just mix all these issues together and we just make a cycle.
Have you seen that video where one of the spokespersons for the yellow vest, Ingrid Levavasseur, went to the last gathering, I think last Saturday, and for some reason, which I'm not an expert on yellow vest, so I wouldn't know why she wasn't very welcome there. You know how they called her? They called her a dirty Jew. And that's on tape, and that's the first thing that came to their mind. I don't know if Ingrid Levavasseur is a Jew or not. Nothing makes me presume that she is or that she isn't. But it's telling. And by that, I'm not willing, and I'm not trying to say or to implicate that all yellow vests are Jewish, or I'm sorry, that's a very, very funny lapsus on my slip of the tongue, that all yellow vests are anti-Semitic. That's not what I'm saying. I am saying it's just not enough to wipe your hands on it and say, we're against it.
Who has wiped his hands about it? I don't understand that. At what moment do you see someone wiping his hand about it? Haven't you seen unanimous condemned by all the spokespersons of the... Well, you haven't looked at them because they're very clear, very explicit on that.
I've seen people.
No, spokespersons of the
I've seen people on television explaining that we're not so sure Alain Finkielkraut was the victim of the
and himself said it. He wasn't treated of dirty.
That I haven't heard.
He said that.
That I haven't heard.
He said that.
I've seen people on the far left.
Well, you should have heard that. I'm sorry. I mean, we debate on facts.
We probably don't live in the same reality.
Yeah, probably.
I've seen people also on the far left explain that,
So you're politicizing the debate now. You're using this question to politicize the debate.
From Macron
extraordinary.
To try and divert attention from the yellow vests. And I've seen people on the far right explain that, the far right has never been anti-Semitic. And the far right is all about giving power to the people, not at all about being anti-Semitic. And that it's now being presented as an anti-Semitic movement by Zionists.
Yeah.
And to be very honest, And to
very, very quickly, because we're out of time, unfortunately.
I'm sorry. To be very honest, to point back on what Ben was saying, we are seeing a moment where the truth doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah, visibly.
Yeah, visibly.
In your
and Alain Finkielkraut...
disagreement on this. We're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately. Ruben Sfaj, I want to thank you. I want to thank you so much. Juan Branco, I want to thank as well. Ben Gidley for joining us from London. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.